Well, my friends, thank you very much for coming on this wet afternoon. It is a huge pleasure to be here introducing this subject and these two wonderful speakers today. This is not a subject that many would think traditionally overlaps with the areas that I have traditionally written about here at Policy Exchange. It doesn't overlap with the military, it doesn't particularly overlap with the rule of law, and it doesn't seem to overlap with foreign affairs. But I would argue actually it overlaps with all of them, because this is such a fundamental issue. It's a fundamental issue about the identity of our communities, the nature of our places, and the beauty with which we surround ourselves, and therefore how we interact with each other. I think this is, in many ways, the fundamental question for the idea of place and the idea of sense that the modern world is really struggling with. Now, it's great that we're here at Policy Exchange because, as you may know, they've started the Building Beautiful month, which is building on the government's work, building more, building beautiful, and Policy Exchange has already written a report on exactly that subject. We know that James Brokenshire and Kit Malthouse, the ministers responsible, have been extremely supportive, and we know, of course, James is going to be here a little bit later to take Marwa on a tour of London. I presume not the whole of London, but selected areas. This is, I would argue, particularly important today, as we are incredibly conscious that the struggle of ownership in our community of anybody under the age of 40 could lead to a pressure to build anything, to just throw it up cheap. But the reality is the cost that we will pay for that in years to come is very real. And we know that because we see the destruction of communities with the ideas of streets in the sky, the idea of brutalism that was so advanced by architects who chose to live in Georgian splendor. That we have got to be very conscious that the decisions we take now, we will pay for many, many years to come. Now, few places express that quite as vividly as Syria. And one of the things that always struck me when I was there, and I spent many years in that wonderful country, was the moment you leave the heart of the city, the moment you leave the walled area, and indeed sometimes even when you're inside it, whether it's in Aleppo or Damascus or in fact many other places, you're suddenly confronted with that stark brutality of communist architecture that we got used to in East Germany, but somehow it seems so much more oppressive when it's confronted, challenged, shaped alongside the beauty of the Arabian ideals that are expressed through stone and mosaic and flora. So the idea of place, the idea of identity that this brutalism challenges is what Marwa has spoken about. She's a practicing architect, as many of you will know, from Homs, and has spoken very fluently on this subject, on the idea of identity, on the concept of belonging, and the nature of place to that belonging. And so it's an enormous privilege to have her here today. I should also say it's a huge privilege for me to have Sir Roger here as well, as Roger is one of the guardians, I think, of the idea of beauty and of responsibility in architecture in the United Kingdom, and shaping our environment so that it shapes us in return, and it raises our eyes and indeed raises our communities to greater heights. So thank you very much to both of you. It's a privilege to be here, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
I think we're going to proceed by Marwa talking for 15 minutes, then I shall give my spiel, and then there'll be some kind of discussion between us, and then we open it to the floor. And I think that's the way it will proceed. We might call upon you, Tom, to be the chairman if there's a rabble of questions that we can't deal with. Yeah, good. So, Marwa.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah? I think my mic is it working? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Yanni? So for 8 years now, the news of the Syrian war have been the talk of the world, but little discussed is the crises that preceded it and effectively led to it. In relation to this ongoing war, Syria has been suffering from a housing crisis for over 50 years. You might be surprised to learn that my country's capital and your country's capital shared the same top 10 list in 2010, being both ranked among the most expensive cities in real estate. So London was ranked third with 1,403 euros for the square meter, and Damascus was ranked eighth with 979 euros for square meter. Apparently, as a Syrian, at the time, I had a greater chance to buy a house in New York than to buy one in Damascus. The report, which showed these results in 2010, compared the average salary of the Syrian citizen, then $300, with the price of an apartment in a posh Damascene neighborhood, which was listed for $5 million. What wasn't mentioned in the report, though, that 1 square meter in those neighborhood is estimated between $5,000 and $10,000, while in certain commercial areas, the price can reach $15,000 for 1 square meters. Quite away from luxury, to buy a flat in Syria before the war meant that you must have an access to at least $500,000 to acquire the average apartment, which will probably cost you double to be inhabited and commuted. To solve this dilemma, Syrians built their own housing informally and illegally in what has become known as Syrian informalities. After being built as bare block buildings, cramped and haphazard, the government installed basic infrastructure poorly and neglectfully. In 2010, 40% of Syrian population lived in informalities. Today, after the mass destruction, some reports say that the percentage has reached over 60% of the population. The government before the war used to, every now and then, pick one area of the 157 informalities to be evacuated and to create so-called a development project. Most of what has been built was used for the market broking. So more and more vacant, horrible-looking buildings get erected, real estate prices inflate, and people get displaced. Therefore, it was hardly a surprise that when the war broke, most of the destroyed areas during the war were informalities in themselves. These areas were the places where violence first erupted and where chaos prevailed. It was a shocking proof to the fact that when places fail to create attachments with the people, stability collapses, and it won't be a pleasant sight. In my book, The Battle for Home, published here in London, I've shed a light on the social role of architecture and made the link between architecture and conflict. I've showed how the colonial enforced modernization of our cities in the region had sabotaged the urban and social fabric, and how its mode of segregation led effectively to sectarian antagonism and general alienation. On the other hand, the subject under attack, which was the old Islamic cities, were able for centuries to sustain peaceful coexistence among their various ethnicities and confessions by the virtue of their ability to provide homes, not merely houses, to people. The architecture of those old cores wasn't simply a game of proportions and harmonies. Professor Roger Scruton's book, The Aesthetics of Architecture, taught me invaluable lessons about the moralism of brick and mortar and the meaning of architecture. When the war broke in my country, the question of meaning led me to investigate where we've lost in communication with our built environment. I found my calling in those old Islamic cities. By making the comparison with the other built patterns, I've discovered that the enduring contribution of the old Islamic cities in binding communities and safeguarding civic peace rested largely on the way their planning and architecture were created. They have embodied the perpetuated values of unity, equality, generosity, dignity, and tolerance. And for that, they were not projects, rather places that people loved, belonged, and cared to sustain. Unfortunately, large parts of those cities were vandalized before the war in the name of false development and by the attraction to lucrative trade, which you know very well, the real estate investing. Today, the average Syrian city's salary is not $300 anymore. It has become $30. But the real estate market has more or less kept its numbers. Less than average apartments are being sold now for $100,000 a unit, with rent places multiplying 10 times in regulated areas and 17 times in informalities. Bear with me there. In preparation for reconstruction, the government has finally decided to look at the informalities, but many wish it never did, because instead of addressing the housing crisis at the root, it decided to raise off the branches, namely to destroy the informal areas altogether and confiscate the land. And since those inhabitants, on the whole, don't have legal documents for their properties, they will be displaced. In place, there will be company-built development projects, high-rises, and shopping malls. The unbuilt 100 square meter apartment still on the map right now is being sold in one of those recent projects in Damascus for $500,000. Some of you may have heard of the controversial law number 10, issued recently in 2018, which has occupied the pages of international humanitarian reporting because of concern over demographical engineering. The new law put all tenants in front one of three options. Either A, to become shareholders in the rebuilding, B, to sell their shares in a public auction, or C, to establish their own contributing company to invest and rebuild at the project. For me, the most threatening aspect of this law is that it turns all people into investors. And by that, it kills any chance of creating home for people. Everybody will be busy climbing the property ladder, which only lead to further crises. I won't be breaking any new news, if I'm going to explain the Syrian housing crisis by listing reasons you already know and even experiencing here in Britain, such as the lack of housing due immigration from the countryside to the city, the increase of population, and financial crisis, and so on. However, the key issue to consider in Syria is that governments like the Syrian and the English tend to make the same mistake of equalizing houses and homes. More houses doesn't mean more homes. We must remember that home is not commodity. Home is a community. And it's all too related to how we build and not how much we build. We have made this mistake in Syria, and look where it has got us. But what pains me the most is that we seem not to have learned anything from it. Syria is betting to be resurrected, or to resurrect itself by the help of many beneficiaries. But one category is critical and overlooked, is the new, quote, Syrian tourists. I'm not speaking about the well-known Syrian businessmen only. I'm speaking about millions of those who emigrated, whether before the war or during, and who are already visiting in the summer, not only for leisure, but also for scanning the real estate market. Like the case in neighboring Lebanon, our fellow old Syrian citizens, new tourists, will buy and broke in this market like in the good old days before the war, but this time the currency difference is to their favor. Their houses, which they've left behind, will be rented. Their prices will dictate the terms in the market. Their numerous houses, bought for investment, will shut down blinds all year and open in the summer. So will the lives of the rest of us remaining. If there will be any chance for peace in this region, and if we are going to avoid mistakes made in Europe after the war, this should not be the case. I think the old policy of ownership in Syria to Syrians only should be back. Then high taxes must be enforced on non-residency status, as well as on acquiring a second home, whether for individuals or within one family. Then taxes should be entirely used to enhance the quality of streets and building new homes. The result will be an end to the game of broking, thus more houses and lower prices for people. The benefits of this natural restoration of affordable prices and availability of space is that a room for rebuilding beautiful and embracing neighborhoods, like once was in the old city, will be created. local businesses will thrive, and a healthy cycle of market exchange will be restored. In short, instead of being cornered and expelled, people will find home. Only then, I believe, a road to stability and peace will be open. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Marwa, for that very impressive summary of a really complicated situation, one that, of course, only to some extent is paralleled by us here, but nevertheless clearly is full of lessons for us, in particular about the lessons about the long-term cost of short-term solutions in the housing field. I wanted to say a few things about the housing question as we confront it here, and in particular the questions to do with design and how design fits in to the settlement pattern and so on. The question at issue for us in Britain is how we are to create not just houses sufficient to provide the roofs over people's heads that they need, but settlements and neighborhoods which turn those houses into homes. This is something you say very well, that in Syria there are plenty of houses being built, but no homes. I think that we have felt very strongly that the possibility that that might be our future too. Of course, after the Second World War, as everybody knows, there was a rush to build new housing for people coming back from the war, for displaced neighborhoods and so on. And there was an urgent desire not just to settle people in places of their own, but also to create urban environments that would be contained and not spread out all over the countryside. And this led to some very strange thinking about how we should really treat our cities. The clearance of the East End of London, for instance, and the its replacement by high-rise estates, which caused enormous social problems and has led to essentially to the loss of the working class heart of the capital city. And I think what we actually need is a conception of how you build a neighborhood. And the word neighborhood, which is an old Saxon word, comes from the Saxon root which says the neighbor, the nachbar, the person who builds nearby. You know, so that into our very concept of the neighbor is a conception. There's a conception of building that has been, as it were, worked into the concept. But it is also the idea of the neighbor has come to us with a religious overtone too. You know, the two great commandments that are the founding commandments of the Christian religion, namely to love God entirely and to love your neighbor as yourself. In English, at least, used again that word neighbor to indicate a kind of duty of love towards those all around you. And I think you would say that there's the Islamic version of this, that to build with to think always of the seventh neighbor in everything that you do. That there is a form of duty here which has love as its purpose, and which is what is involved in building it ultimately, creating communities of mutual support where their affection and support can endure. Now, obviously, if you build in the wrong way, you create competition between groups, some of whom have feel themselves excluded, others of whom take advantage of all those developments that you referred to seize hold of seize the advantage over their neighbors. And as you rightly said, there's a colonial legacy in your country which led to the regimentation and the vandalization of the old Arabian centers to the cities, which essentially created a new kind of building, one that wasn't a shared home, but was a kind of an asset to be competed over. And we've had the same problem here. And after the war, the destruction of our town centres, their replacement in many areas by social housing, gave rise to similar competition, especially among immigrant groups who wanted to seize control of the privileges connected with those forms of development. My feeling is that we can't solve the big problems that you were referring to, civil order, migration, social and tribal and religious conflict. We can't solve those problems through architecture, but it's evident from all that you say that we can make them worse, and I think that we have made them worse in this country. And through the policies of clearance and the lack of respect for the idea of neighbourhood. Policies of clearance, I think, you might think these are something rare in human history, but in fact they seem to be a constantly recurring theme in the 20th century and onwards. Stalin's clearance of whole populations from one part of the Soviet Union and resettling them elsewhere, often without any housing, of course. But right through to the clearance of the East End of London, we have a long record of disasters. But there are, of course, some successes, such as the clearance of the central quarters of Paris by Baron Haussmann under orders from Napoleon III, which, although were regarded at the time as a terrible injustice to the people there, and that involved the loss of very beautiful and quaint areas of the city, also produced a real city which is still centralized and whose population could still live in the new quarters that Haussmann built. And I think that is, perhaps we ought to think of that case and compare it with all those things that you refer to, the building of informalities outside the law all around the city. Maybe at some stage we have to think about how we develop the inner reaches of the city in such a way as to retain the existing population. How do we give people an interest in maintaining the places where they settle, in a house of their own and on a street that they share? Now, my feeling is that as we face this problem in Britain, we are greatly in need of some research into what the real distinction is between a well-maintained area which people love and regard as their home and are prepared to make sacrifices to retain as an orderly environment, and the ill-maintained areas where things are neglected and left to decline, and in which property values collapse and buildings are not maintained in a way which enables them to endure. I think that research will come up with a very important results, and in particular the result that people will maintain their environment if they regard it as not just as a home, but as something which is beautiful in itself. Your neighbour's house is not yours to maintain. You don't go round there with your toolbox in order to put everything right when it goes wrong. And in that sense, it's not your direct interest. But the way it looks is your direct interest. And the more people can take pleasure in the appearance of their neighbour's house, the more they come to share the settlement as a joint, joint ownership over it, and will become willing to make sacrifices in order to maintain its not only its appearance, but also the social amenities that it offers. And I think that's one of that research has still to be done, and people know, some of this has been, there have been a lot of reports. Nick Boys-Smith here has done some research on the comparison between the street and the tower block in this connection, showing that people do not only prefer to live in streets, but are more prepared to maintain them than to live in tower blocks, which are surrounded by areas of neglect. And I think that the lesson from that has yet to be learned here in Britain. All over London we see tower blocks being built, creating this, not something quite as appalling as the informalities that you refer to in Syria, but something nevertheless that will within 10 or 15 years be both an aesthetic and a social disaster. Because, as we know, tower blocks do not form communities, whereas streets do. There was a community in the East End of London and communities all over the northern cities, which were created by those back-to-back Victorian streets of terraced houses, in which people didn't merely come to know each other, but took each other's destiny and needs seriously. But I don't think there is a tower block community in existence. One attempt to create such a thing, the Tower Hamlets of London, has created one of the most crime-ridden and disastrous areas of the capital, and one which is not only avoided by everybody because it looks so awful, but from which people flee as soon as they can when they've been put there by the social housing machine. So I think all that means that we have to think very seriously, as you've been thinking about Syria, as to exactly how we build neighborhoods and settlements which can be regarded as homes to the people who share them. I think that it's one of the good pieces of news that the government has decided not just to think about this, but to recognize that aesthetic values, the way things look, the way things that look to the person who's not living in them, is at the center of the public response to new building. You made some interesting suggestions about legal matters. For instance, forbidding of alien ownership of properties, and maybe penalizing the ownership of second homes and so on. We have a great problem, of course, as members of the European Union, something which, of course, we won't be for long. We had to accept this supposed freedom of movement of labour and capital, and the freedom of ownership of land as part of the original deal of the Treaty of Rome. And that has meant that it became impossible immediately to say that only a British citizen should be allowed to own land in this country, which goes against the whole tradition of land law in our country, which has never actually accepted that anybody owns anything except the Queen. Everything was supposed to be a freehold, but this ownership of land and houses and so on in a place where you not only don't belong yourself, but have no intention of residing, is one of the basic disasters, because it means you have no interest in maintaining that place as a home, but only in selling it on as capital. And that's what you're describing in your country. And I think London has suffered enormously from this. The most beautiful parts of London are owned by people who reside elsewhere, largely in criminal places like China and Russia, where they wouldn't enjoy the same security of ownership as they enjoy here. We can provide security to the owner of property because we have a proper legal system and proper policing. But so to the advantage of a Malaysian billionaire to invest in property in London, but of course that means that most of the Londoners are unable to afford to live here themselves. So here we are. I think those questions are also, although they're a completely different order of question, they have to be dealt with. And just who has the title, the entitlement to own property, own land, in a country of which he's not a citizen. I don't know whether you want to respond to any of that, or whether we want questions from the audience about.
I just want to comment that you've spoke about how things look and how houses should be beautiful and should be attractive to people to maintain, but also the combining the aesthetic aspect with the affordable aspect, I guess is the main challenge. Because, for example, in the old Islamic city in Syria, people started selling their houses despite being very, very pleasant and very aesthetically pleasing. But because they are turned, as I said, into investors, they have no longer, either they are, attracted to money more than to residing, or they just, calculating this as, an extended family will have more houses. If they sold one house, they will have 3 or 4 houses outside of the old city. So I think the problem is how to combine both aspects, and I think that taxes is an economic tactic, but it could work hand in hand with designing houses.
Yeah, I agree. This has been one of the great issues in our country. How do you develop affordable houses, which are also appropriate to the place where they're built, and which fit in with existing architecture, and which don't lower the value of the place where they're being built? And that's an enormously difficult question to answer. All of our cities in Europe have this problem, that the old...
They are up to sale.
Yes, they are up for sale. The old centres are beautiful places, marvellous places to spend a holiday 2 weeks a year and leave the flat empty for the rest of the year. And this is, of course, in the long run, unsustainable. If there is nobody living in the centre of Paris, there is no Paris. And again, I think we need to do all the research into this to discover exactly what incentives can be provided to ensure that people do go on revitalizing the cities where they live, and also how should these cities be adapted to the new forms of life. Any questions from the audience? There's lots of questions here. Gentleman there, and yes.
Georgian architecture is widely admired. Something I appreciated when at university in Edinburgh, Georgian architecture, those terraces were designed as a solution to a rising population. And are those terraces, 3 or 4 flats, something we should look at again?
Well, of course, the great problem with Edinburgh Newtown, which is what you're referring to, I think, is that nobody lives there anymore. It's all offices. Because these terraces are so nice, solicitors and the like install themselves, and that certainly is a planning mistake. Those parts of Edinburgh received some kind of a planning ordinance that dedicated them to residential accommodation, I think they would have served the purpose very well. And of course, one should look at the way they were built. This is something that Leon Creer and Quinlan Terry were tried to do in Poundbury, to create effective Georgian terraces which would be suited to the new kind of residents and that would be affordable to them. And when I first moved to London, age 16, I squatted in a Georgian terrace in Cannon Street in the East End, near Stepney Green's tube station, which was, there were 16 usually people living in that place, most of whom you did know from one day to the next, and it was a very effective way of solving the population problem. But it was pulled down as insalubrious. That's the problem. When buildings actually get lived in, they become insalubrious because people are insalubrious. And until we wake up to the fact, this fact, you know, we'll always be making sterilized areas in which will be destined to be offices. Nick Boyd-Smith, yes.
Thank you, Nicholas Boyd-Smith. I run Create Streets, and thank you for referring to our research. I agree with a lot of what you've both said, and thank you, Marwa, for a fantastic and inspiring talk. A couple of quick observations and perhaps one question. The first is, I think, in the post-war story of the destruction or the abandonment of our historic town centres, there's two important themes that didn't quite come into the conversation so far, which need to be put in. The first is the motor car, and the car has changed people's, or it was fought for generations to be changing people's use of space. So we do need, because the answer is ultimately it's clear, to build more of the type of tight, beautiful town centre that provably people love and will pay more for, which is measurable. So, but we do need to think about, you know, what is the future of the car? Where are cars used? Where are they not used? The second reason is space. The most consistent elasticity in pricing is that people pay more for more space. So one of the pressures that historic town centres have come under as populations increase is there's not enough of it, and the flats get too small, and people, particularly if they've got families, want more space. So there are quite important trade-offs between having more of this type of high-quality environment to get, you know, so that we can fit a growing population into it. And then just, if I may, one observation on what we call the design disconnect. I lose count of the number of meetings with planners or with professionals I've been in where what people provably like is literally laughed at behind closed doors. And the themes of what people like are actually the same in London or in Syria or in China or in Africa or in France. High density or medium density, beautiful, finely grained, complicated facade that has a strong sense of place, which doesn't actually mean it needs to look like it was built in 1830. It just needs to rhyme with something that was built 100 or 50 or 200 years ago, and that can take many forms. But key in this country is fixing that design disconnect, so that the market works, and so that the instinctive and strong and consistent preferences of people are actually not banned by planning policy.
Well, that's a terrifically useful set of observations. I agree with them. I think, well, do you want to add anything to that, Marwa?
I still want to stress the point that when people own multiple houses and when you have competition over real estate, always the nicer places are, the higher the prices would be, because you will have this bidding, this market broking. And I think, for example, in our case in Syria, this is how all the housing crisis started. But because there are space, I mean, if you look at the map of the city, you will find there is space, but the sharing of the space is not there. So could be, I mean, the shares are not equally distributed. So one company will have 1,000 square meters, while a family will have just 50 square meters. And that's just because people can, you know, afford more. And when you open the doors of the market in the real estate market in this way, it doesn't matter how it matters. But I mean, the nicer the places will look, the higher their prices will be, and the further the people will be pushed back away from those places.
The gentleman there at the back, yes, here, there.
Warwick Life, I work here at Policy Exchange. I'd like to ask a little bit more about the architecture in Syria and the tradition that you celebrate. I noticed that Tom, and I think Sir Roger referred to it as Arabic, and I think you use the expression Islamic.
Yes.
And what intrigues me, to what extent is it some universal principle that you can find in a wide range of different Islamic communities? To what extent is it maybe an Ottoman tradition, and to what extent is it very specifically Arab or Syrian tradition?
So this is even a controversial terminology, even within the Middle East, because the word Islamic is avoided basically by people who are suspicious of Islam. But it's Islamic style, just, you know, a definitive word of a style like the Gothic, like a Christian architecture. You cannot deny it's a Christian architecture, as well as you cannot deny it's an Islamic architecture, because it's driven from the thought of Islam, and it's also the product of an era where Islam was the mainstream, you know, setter of values, and in this regard, there is no Arabic architecture. There is no Arabic product of culture, because Arabism is under the wing of Islam. Before Islam, there was no Arabic style, which, you know, different tribal styles of whether it's Roman here, whether it's, you know, an ancient kingdom there. But after the Islamic era, there has been different styles until you had the final layer, which is the Ottoman architecture, which is also Islamic architecture. So when you study Islamic architecture, you would notice this thread that connects the different styles, whether Ottoman or Ayyubid or Mamluk, whatever. I mean, you will find the thread, which is the values that were set by the Islamic thought. Yeah.
Very good. Yes, John Hayes. Yes.
I really appreciated the speaker's distinction between homes and houses. You know, it is shared between corporatist liberals and cultural Marxists that they detach considerations of public policy from the personal. They speak of labour rather than creating jobs, and they speak of assets, freeing assets rather than spending money, and they speak of housing rather than homes. So it was welcome to hear you make that clear distinction. And I take it as axiomatic that we need beautiful things and that defines our sense of place and worth. But I just wanted to raise an issue on which I'd invite your remarks about green space. It is true that we need to build beautiful buildings, both commercial and domestic, by the way. Too much of this debate sometimes just is about houses and not about factories and offices and all the other things that are now so ugly too. But green space matters too, doesn't it? And not only private green space, but public green space. So if you think of the London squares and the great parks, why is it, in your judgment, that so few public policymakers take account of the possibility of creating new urban and suburban green space? Earlier generations gifted us what we have, but what's going to be our gift to the next generation if we eat up what's there and add no more?
Yes, this is a very important question. Is there any effort in Syria to include proper public parks
the thing is,
in
greenery.
development? There's greenery.
Greenery was either within. I mean, within. Well, I'm talking about until the time of the Ottoman rule has vanished. So the courtyard housing was each one's own garden, and the public greenery was the orchards. So the orchards next on riverbanks or orchards that surrounded the cities and provided food, the farms, were places where people go and have picnics outside. So it's a different allocation of space than the modern urban planning. But now we don't have. I mean, we don't have part of. I mean, the problems that our cities in Syria suffer from is we don't have this this element of nature celebrated in our cities, rather just neglected to a very serious degree.
I mean, I think here in London, London is unique in the quantity of green space scattered around. I can't remember, I saw a figure the other day, something like 40% of the land area is green within the Greater London area. And that's a historical accident due to the patterns of ownership whereby it was developed and so on, and the royal parks and all the rest. So, but it's absolutely true that one must think about those other spaces which are shared, not just the spaces where people have their homes, and what kind of sharing will it lead to as well? I mean, a kind of, a desultory little, much trampled area of public greenery between two tower blocks is not a space that refreshes anyone. And the question is, how do you get that real, the lung of the city, as it's often called? Let's have another question. Lady there, yes.
Lise Doucette from the BBC. Thank you very much, Marwa and Sir Roger, for your comments. Marwa, as you know very well, in Syria now, rebuilding, reconstruction is very political, and that the government and its powerful allies like Russia are looking for money, putting pressure on the European Union to provide reconstruction funds. Since I think there are many prominent, if not powerful, architects in this room, and maybe even a few powerful politicians, I wonder if you could give any advice here about how, and if it would be welcome and useful for the outside world to try to strengthen voices like yours, calling for some thought going into building, not just putting up housing because it's more cheap. Is there any way that more thoughtful kind of advice can come with the resources, if they come, to start that rebuilding?
So, you know that architecture is political in so many ways, like you have referred, but I think that, and this is something that I always refer to, that we lack the base, that the infrastructure, basically, the human infrastructure and the cultural infrastructure that could allow the civil society in Syria and the architects and engineers in Syria to have channeled voices, to have platforms that they could have discussions within Syria, rather to have it here in London or elsewhere, which is good. But I mean, we have to, I think, the first thing that we should build as an architect, not as a politician who could, take a decision on reconstruction as a whole. I could recommend creating platforms that could create the space and the arena for people like people here today to come to Syria and to for the Syrians as well to have voices within their country and have the discussion, have the discussion there in Syria and build the capacity of the Syrian architects and engineers and students, because as you may well know, Lise, that the education back in Syria is brought to its knees now with the war, and as future generations being graduated from different majors of engineering and architecture, the country will depend on them to rebuild the country. They are not very well educated, and the public as well have lost voice and have lost interest, and the message also blurred for them. And to raise this awareness and to put things in the right place, you need this infrastructure, as it said. Yes.
This gentleman there in the front, yes.
Rowan Moore from The Observer. Firstly, there are actually some very good, very recent examples of new housing developments by local authorities in London, in Hackney, in Brent, Camden, Newham, which have a lot of the qualities we're talking about without actually having necessarily a sort of historical Georgian style. So I very much hope on your tour of London you get to see one or two of those. But I want to ask a question which is a little bit related to that, because in your book you talk very eloquently about how a kind of modernist form of housing was used in a very destructive way, and kind of modernist ideas of zoning. You also talk about the way in which the restoration of historic buildings was also kind of commandeered by basically corrupt entities, and very poor quality kind of so-called historic buildings were built. I'm right about that, yes? That was before the war, that was a problem.
Just speak up a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm saying that before the war in Syria, this is something you describe in your book, is that some work was done that was called historical restoration, that was done very, very badly, because essentially it was being done by corrupt entities that served one part of the community and not others. Yes, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So for me, that says the problem is bigger than one of architectural style. I mean, you can have bad modern buildings, you can have bad traditional buildings.
Yeah.
So what's the really important thing in this? Is it really politics and economics before architecture?
No, as I was telling you, I was answering Lisa's question, is that we have to tackle different areas here at the same time. So, for example, it's not only on political front, for example, or economic front, only that. You need also the public with you, right? You need to know, because people will say now, voices are saying, enable the civil society, ask people what they want. And you may be surprised that many people may just want to exchange apartments, or just, buy and sell to have a bigger apartment here, or, so the style of architecture would be compromised. And as I told you, that the old city was sold off by its people, as well as being vandalized by the city authority. So I think we have two fronts here to tackle at the same time, to give voice to the public, and to raise the awareness and create the discussion there by creating platforms and channels for those people and re-educating ourselves. And on the other hand, you would have another voice with you to go through the political battles and defend what matters to them and be on agreement of what matters. Yes.
I think that's a really important question, and your reference to the way in which the old cities are sold off by their residents, I think it's a very important one. I remember when I used to visit Prague in the communist days, I was astonished not just by the decrepit beauty of the place, but by the fact that it had the old population of Prague living in it. Because, of course, you couldn't buy and sell then. And there they were. That was the city as it had always been, with real people in it. As soon as the changes came, of course, they vanished, those people. Now Prague is owned largely by wealthy Americans and people from the rest of Europe, how to prevent that happening without using the extreme measures that the communists used is one of the great problems. Anyway, there's a question here. Sorry, yeah, John.
Clearly, there was an agenda on the part of clearly, there was an agenda on the part of the modernist brutalists in the post-war period or in the colonial period of Syria. People like James Sterling and what have you wanted to disrupt the culture, to destroy traditional forms of community. What are the politics of architecture today? Are there similarly motivated people dominating architecture, or is it a much more complex situation?
This is a question that Marwa and I have discussed to some extent. There's no doubt that the schools of architecture and the RIBA and its associated networks did buy into the sort of high propaganda of the modernists in the post-war period, and had already been doing so in the 20s and 30s. And the models proposed in schools of architecture right through to quite recently were Le Corbusier and Gropius, the Bauhaus and all that. I remember in my day in Cambridge in the 1970s that the architecture school under Stanislasden, I think it was teaching people how to redevelop whole towns on the pattern given to us by Le Corbusier and his plan for Algiers, which involved wiping away the whole city and putting completely absurd structures which obliterated the coastline with cars on a motorway on top of the tower blocks. And this was regarded as a work of genius, partly because it could never be refuted by being built, So, and I think that certainly that collapse of architectural education occurred. There's no doubt about it. But we were talking about this only yesterday. Even if you could restore the education that was contained in a a Renaissance pattern book about how to match details to details and build facades and all the rest. Even if you do that, you've got the other problem with the education of the workmen needed to produce the parts, and how to give them the kind of employment on the building site which will make it worthwhile to have the learning that they would need. So you would need to revise the whole process of education throughout the building and architectural profession, really to restore what the knowledge that people once had in the 18th century. So you have to think about how to do it in another way, I think, with other materials and perhaps taking shortcuts and all that. And while it is profitable for the architect to build huge buildings with curtain wall structures with steel frames and glass facades or other non-facades, while that is profitable, why should they bother to re-educate themselves? It's
Can I
like...
stop you here?
Sorry?
Can
Yeah,
I
sorry,
stop you?
I'm going on. Yeah.
Yeah, no. But I mean, to be fair to architects, it's not because...
I've never been fair to architects.
Yeah, that's why I'm
It's
here.
a new thing.
Yeah,
Yeah. You're the only one I've ever been fair to.
So it's not a matter of profitable, then that's what I said to you yesterday. Then it's more practical for architects. The availability of building materials and building skills is to a large degree dictate what kind of design will be made, because architects tend to solve problems, right? So if you design something very beautiful and you didn't have any labor to execute, and you didn't have a proper building material to use, then the client will complain about the cost, and then you have to go with the practical here solution and not go with the very expensive. So I think it's part, like we said, I believe the one part of solving the problem in Syria to revive the vocations that were involved in traditional building. So if this was available in a niche market, maybe the architect could just tap onto this and build something that could use that. No. Go on now.
Is there, a question just here? Yes. Thank you.
James Kidner from Improbable, a technology firm, but a fascinating discussion and a privilege to hear it. It's a very important problem, but it's also a very urgent problem, both in this country and clearly in Syria too. Sort of getting it wrong has an increasing cost that is, if you like, exponential. In this country, we trumpet the triumph of lots more house building, but all we're doing is sprinkling Basingstoke around every settlement that we have in the country, with no reference to the locality, with all due respect to anyone who lives there, sorry. I want to ask a question about the viability of terraces, because one of the things that has certainly blighted housing design in this country has been this assumption that everyone prefers a detached house. And it, in a sense, ties in with Marwa's observation that the traditional Syrian design was very much an inward-looking house where people couldn't, in a sense, see it or have any sense of it from beyond. Terraces kind of allow people to engage from the outside in ways that detached houses don't. What's the way to tie those things together?
It's an interesting question.
Yeah. How to involve the inward design with the detached housing?
How to resolve the passerby with the house that's behind you?
Yeah. I think the passerby for example, in the old cities in Syria was engaged all the way along, because the exterior of those buildings wasn't forbidding. So although it was inward looking, it wasn't forbidding, but it wasn't about ornament, and it wasn't about, to a certain degree, ostentation. So you were greeted by, let's say, jasmine and street bridges and shadows and lights and stones and welcoming doors. So I think the passerby in those alleyways, still till this day, they express, their fascination by how welcoming and embracing those cities were. from my view as well, the important thing that they were, a very kind in a way to community by not showing class division. So you cannot notice that this is a mansion to a rich man, and this is, a poor family house. And in this way, connected classes, because people could live together and next to each other. Yeah.
That's a very good observation. I think I'm not sure about the logistics of this, but I suspect we're coming to the end of the time. So let me take just 2 or 3 questions in a row, starting with David Goodhart. But a short question that we can all digest.
Yeah, just a brief observation and a question. One of the few bits of our housing market that seems to work at the moment is the student housing market. Wherever I go to a university town, they're throwing up housing, often rather good-looking sort of mid-rise housing. And the irony is that the one bit of housing market that works is by definition transient. It is not producing permanent neighbourhoods and communities. It's producing buildings that people are going to live in 3 years or 2 years and then go away. My question is, what about all the Syrian architects and engineers who are now living in Dusseldorf or other parts of Europe? Are they going to go home and help rebuild Syria? I mean, is there a kind of I mean, I know conflict hasn't completely ended yet, but I mean, is there going to be a sort of a surge of return and sort of idealism? We've got to rebuild our country, or will most people stay where they are who've left the country?
I know the nations. Yeah, please.
We'll just take 2 more questions before the lady. Yes, sorry, I should know your name.
Just to reinforce Marwa's point about education, in my experience. In Damascus, when I bought my house back in 2005, and you talk about people moving out, actually they were desperate to move out. These were people who were not very well educated about their own environment, and they wanted to move to horrible blocks in the outskirts. They were desperate to leave behind the old courtyard houses, which is why they were all falling down. So what we really need is the education, as you rightly point out, the infrastructure of people inside the country who can speak up for the values that people now beginning to realise that they've lost.
One more question, perhaps is a short question, not a long peroration about how the maltreatment of Kurds over the centuries.
I promise. Hajir Temurian, member of the Council of Migration Watch. We estimate that the population of Britain will be 83 million, the greatest among the big nations of Europe by the middle of this century. Already, I think we are the more populated than Holland. How do you, if you project your mind, Roger, especially to the future, how do you see our future? Will there be any green belt around cities in about 50 years' time?
Well, there's 3 questions. Mar, would you like to respond to those?
Yeah, I will respond to the gentleman's question. That I know that regarding refugee architects now we are speaking of, the nations, politically, those nations are enforcing such comeback. So, for example, Germany would enforce getting those, those people, those architects, those Syrian architects to come back and help in the rebuilding. But, I can't tell, I can't know, because we don't have this infrastructure that I mentioned. We don't have this platform that we could, know how many architects are there out and how far they're in their education, what views they are representing, and what plans they are having. We don't have this assemblage of power, if you will, that we desperately need to start the rebuilding. Otherwise, just one sentence, that otherwise we'll leave the gap for companies and foreign companies to come and build.
Yeah. Absolutely, and Polish jerry builders. Yeah. Well, in response to Hajir Temurian's question, 83 million people is far too many. But then this is a general problem of the world anyway, overpopulation, and it doesn't. there's no point in saying we can't deal with that, so let's give up. On the contrary, this underlines the urgency of the question that we're considering. We don't want to build new housing which will just lay in store for us, our children and grandchildren, irremediable social conflict. We do want to make places and communities, and even if that means that there'll be a restricted amount of countryside left for our descendants, nevertheless, as long as they restore fox hunting, who cares? I think that's about it, really. And thank you very much, Marwa Al-Sabouni, for that wonderful talk, and thank you, everyone, for all the questions.
Thank you.